The woman my family spent 15 years warning me about was standing in my kitchen, drinking my coffee, and asking me if I wanted sugar in mine. That sentence sounds impossible, I know that. But by the time you understand how I got there, you'll realize the impossible part wasn't her standing in my kitchen. The impossible part was everything that came before. My name is Cassie. I'm 31 years old. I'm a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio. I know how to read contracts, how to spot language that hides something, how to follow a paper trail until it leads somewhere someone didn't want you to go. I'm good at my job. I've always been good at paying attention to details, which makes it stranger, in hindsight, that I spent the first 28 years of my life not paying attention at all. Her name was Diane. She lived 4 houses down from the house where I grew up. A pale yellow colonial with white shutters and a wind chime on the porch that I could hear from my bedroom window on quiet nights. My mother called her that woman. My father called her dangerous. My older brother called her worse things than that. By the time I was old enough to ask why, the answer was always the same. Stay away from her, Cassie. Just stay away. So I did. For 28 years, I crossed to the other side of the street when I saw her coming. I looked away at the mailbox. I pretended not to hear her if she said hello, because that's what you do when you love your family. You trust them. You believe they have reasons even when they don't share those reasons. You tell yourself there are things adults understand that children aren't meant to. I told myself that for a very long time. I stopped telling myself that on a Tuesday in March, when my father was in the hospital with a cardiac event, my mother was sitting in a waiting room 2 floors above me, and I found a document in my father's desk drawer that had my name on it, and a stranger's signature where my father should have been. That was the first thread. I pulled it, and the entire thing came apart. I need to go back a little because context matters here. My family, my parents, my brother Marcus, and me looked completely ordinary from the outside. My father, Robert, was an engineer. My mother, Patricia, taught 3rd grade for 22 years before she retired. We had a house, 2 cars, a dog named Buster, who died when I was 14 and whose absence I never fully got over. We had Sunday dinners and Christmas traditions and a family photograph on the wall of the hallway that got updated every few years. We also had Diane. She wasn't a threat in any concrete way I could see. She was just a woman in the neighborhood, probably 15 years older than my parents, who lived alone. She gardened. She drove a navy blue sedan. She waved at people when she walked past. She seemed, from the glimpses I allowed myself, perfectly pleasant. My mother's face told a different story every time Diane's name came up. I learned early not to ask. Once, when I was around 9, I made the mistake of mentioning that Diane had waved at me from her porch, and I'd waved back. My mother's expression went so still and cold that I thought I'd done something genuinely wrong. "We don't wave at that woman," she said. "We don't speak to her. We don't look at her. Do you understand me?" I said yes. I understood nothing, but I said yes. I understood nothing, but I said yes. For years, I constructed my own explanations. Maybe there had been a feud over property lines. Maybe Diane had said something cruel to my mother years ago. Maybe there was a history there, something petty and suburban that had calcified into hatred over time. I told myself it was ordinary neighborhood drama, the kind that lives and dies without explanation. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. My father had his cardiac event on a Wednesday. By Friday, he was stable, but being kept for observation. On Saturday, my mother asked me to go back to the house to pick up some things she needed: a specific cardigan, her reading glasses, her phone charger, and the folder in the top right drawer of your father's desk. The blue one. I let myself in with my key, gathered everything on the list, and went to the desk in his study. There were 2 blue folders in the top right drawer. My mother hadn't specified which one. I opened the first one and found what looked like utility records, nothing urgent. I opened the second one. Inside was a document I didn't immediately understand. It was a property transfer record. The address on it was our house, our family home where my parents had lived for 34 years. The transfer date was 8 months ago. The name it had been transferred to was not my father's name and not my mother's name. It was a name I didn't recognize at all, a trust called the Whitmore Family Revocable Trust. I stood in my father's study for a long time. I'm a paralegal. I know what a property transfer looks like. I know what it means when a house you've lived in for 3 decades gets transferred to a trust you've never heard of 8 months before your father ends up in the hospital. I took photos of every page. I put the folder back exactly as I found it. I brought my mother the blue folder with the utility records. She didn't ask any questions. I didn't offer any answers. But something had shifted in me, quietly, irreversibly, and I drove home thinking about that document the entire way. The next week, while my father was still recovering, I started pulling the thread. The Whitmore Family Revocable Trust was registered in Ohio. Trusts are public record at the county level. It took me 2 days of digging through the county recorder's database to find the trustee name, a man named Gerald Whitmore, address in Dublin, Ohio. I didn't know anyone named Whitmore. I ran the name through every database I had access to through work, property records, court filings, anything public. Gerald Whitmore was 63 years old, had no criminal record, had owned his home in Dublin for 20 years, and was listed as a retired contractor. The only cross-reference I found between Gerald Whitmore and my family was one document, a property sale from 1987, before I was born, in which my father had sold a parcel of land in rural Delaware County to a Robert and Gerald Whitmore, jointly. Robert. My father's name was Robert. That could have been a coincidence. I told myself it was a coincidence. But I've worked in law long enough to know that when 2 things look like coincidence, you keep pulling. I called the Delaware County Recorder's office and asked about that 1987 parcel. The clerk was helpful. She told me the parcel had originally been part of a larger landholding registered to a family estate, the Whitmore estate. I said, "Whitmore? My father's last name is Calloway." She said, "Honey, that's the original family name on the holding. The sale in 1987 was actually a buyback. The land had been sold out of the family in the 1960s, and the purchaser, bought it back." I said slowly, "What was the Whitmore estate originally?" She said, "Oh, a farm, big one. Been in the family going back to the 1920s. I thanked her and sat in my car in the parking garage beneath my office building for 20 minutes, staring at my steering wheel. My father's last name was Calloway. It had always been Calloway, but somehow his name appeared on a 1987 land transaction tied to a family called Whitmore, and now our family home had been transferred to the Whitmore Family Revocable Trust. I needed to talk to someone. And the only someone I could think of, the only person outside my family who might have any piece of this, was the woman I had been told my entire life to stay away from. I want to be clear. I did not go to Diane impulsively. I thought about it for 4 days. I sat with it. I made myself consider every other option. I could ask my mother directly. I could confront my father when he was well enough. I could hire an attorney. I could let it go entirely and pretend I had never opened the wrong blue folder. I couldn't let it go. That's the honest answer. Once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. That's the thing they don't tell you about looking for the truth. There's no version of events where you find half of it and feel satisfied. So on a Thursday evening, I drove to my parents' street. I parked 2 blocks away. I walked to the pale yellow colonial with the wind chime and knocked on the door. Diane answered in about 30 seconds, like she'd been expecting someone. She looked at me for a long moment. She was older than I'd realized, late 60s, I guessed, with silver hair cut close and careful eyes that were neither warm nor cold, just watchful. She said, "You're Cassie." Not a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "I wondered if you'd ever come." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll make coffee." I should have been unnerved by that. I think I was, a little. But I also felt, for the first time in weeks, like I was moving in the right direction, like I had finally, after 28 years of looking away, actually turned and looked at something directly. I went in. What Diane told me over the next 2 hours rearranged everything I thought I knew about my family. I'm going to tell you what she told me, but I want to say first, I verified everything. Every single thing she told me, I verified independently. By the time this was over, I had documentation. I had records. I had a lawyer. I had a judge's ruling. This is not hearsay. This is the truth, as the court also found it. Diane had known my father since he was a child, not because she was a neighbor. She had been a neighbor only since the mid-90s, when she'd moved there deliberately to be close to what she was about to explain to me. She had known my father because her older sister, Eleanor, had married my father's father, my paternal grandfather, a man I had been told died before I was born and whom I had never once questioned. He had not died before I was born. He had died when I was 6. His name had been Gerald Whitmore Sr. My father's legal name at birth had been Robert Gerald Whitmore. He had changed it, legally, officially, with a court order at age 22. Changed it to Calloway, his mother's maiden name, and severed every formal tie to the Whitmore family. Diane showed me a photograph. It was old, slightly faded, the color slightly off in the way of photographs from the late 70s. In it stood a young man I recognized with a jolt that felt physical, like stepping off a curb I hadn't seen. It was my father, young and unsmiling, standing next to an older man with the same jaw in the same way of holding his shoulders. On the other side of the older man stood a woman I assumed was Eleanor, and beside her, clearly younger, clearly Diane. My father had a family, a whole family, a name, a history, a farm in Delaware County that had been in that family since the 1920s. He had walked away from all of it at 22 and never looked back. And he had spent my entire childhood making sure I never looked back either. Making sure I never knew there was anything to look back at. Why? I asked. I think it came out quieter than I meant it to. Diane wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Your grandfather was not a kind man, she said carefully. Your father left because he had to. I don't blame him for that. I never did. But he didn't just leave, he erased. He made your grandmother, your mother, your brother, and you into people with no history, no family, no name but the one he chose. She paused. He took something that wasn't only his to erase. I asked what she meant. She told me about the farm. The Whitmore farm in Delaware County had been held in the family for 3 generations. When my grandfather died, when I was 6, not before I was born, he had left the estate in a trust to be divided equally among his children. My father was one of those children. My great-aunt Eleanor's son, a man named Gerald Whitmore Jr., the same Gerald Whitmore on those documents I'd found, was another. My father had contested the trust for years. Court records I later pulled confirmed it. A decade-long legal dispute over the estate finally settled in 2019. The settlement had given my father a sum of money and, apparently, one other thing, the right to transfer certain assets to the Whitmore Family Revocable Trust as part of the settlement agreement, with Gerald Jr. as trustee, including our family home. I don't know if I can explain how it felt to understand that. Our house, the house where I grew up, where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I had my first sleepover, where I sat with my father on the back porch and watched summer storms, had been transferred into that trust as a settlement asset. Without my knowledge, without my brother's knowledge, as far as I could tell, signed over as a line item in a legal dispute my father had never mentioned to any of us. Does my mother know? I asked. Diane was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Your mother has always known. I drove home that night on autopilot. I don't remember the drive. I remember parking. I remember sitting on my couch without turning on any lights. I remember thinking about all the times I had crossed to the other side of the street. The next morning, I called an attorney. Not someone from my firm, a conflict of interest risk I wasn't going to take, but a property attorney I dealt with through referrals, a careful, methodical woman who had a reputation for being thorough. I laid out everything. The transfer document, the trust, the Delaware County records, the settlement, what Diane had told me, the photographs. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "There are a few questions we need to answer, but the most important one is whether your father had the sole legal right to transfer the family home, or whether you and your brother had any protected interest as long-term residents with a documented claim." I hadn't even thought of that angle. That's what a good attorney is for. It took her 3 weeks to pull the full record. What she found was this. The 2019 settlement agreement had included a clause that required written notification to all household members with a registered interest in the property before any transfer could be made. My brother Marcus had been living elsewhere, but I had been living in that house contributing to the mortgage for 2 years during a period when I'd been between apartments, a fact my father had never mentioned to the settlement mediator. He had signed a document certifying that there were no other parties with a registered residential interest in the property. He had been wrong. Whether intentionally or not, that question was for a court. My attorney filed a motion to review the transfer. When my father came home from the hospital, I had been sitting with what I knew for 6 weeks. I want to be honest about that period because it wasn't clean or simple the way it might sound now. There were nights when I thought about just letting it go. There were phone calls with my mother in which she sounded tired and old, and I thought, what is the point of any of this? There were moments when I felt guilty for pulling a thread that was unraveling people I loved. But then I would think about the house, about the document in the drawer, about my father standing in front of a notary and signing something that said I didn't exist as an interested party when I had lived there, paid toward that mortgage, called that address home. You can love someone and still not let them erase you. That's the thing I had to keep reminding myself. I asked my father to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, at a place near his cardiologist's office, so I had a practical excuse for being in that part of the city. He came in looking better, some color back, moving more carefully, but moving. He hugged me and called me kiddo, the way he always had. And I thought, he has no idea this is coming. I put the photocopies on the table between us. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. His face didn't go through a sequence of expressions the way faces do in movies: shock, then guilt, then denial. It just went very still. Finally, he said, "Where did you find these?" I said. "Does that matter?" He said. "Cassie," I said, "I know about the name. I know about the farm. I know about Gerald Jr. I know about the settlement, and I know what you signed." Another long silence. The coffee shop around us was ordinary and busy, people on laptops, a toddler being difficult about a muffin, someone's phone playing a podcast at low volume. Normal life, happening right next to the moment, mine split in half. He said, "I was trying to protect you." I said, "From what?" He said, "From what?" He said, "From all of it. From having to know any of it. I spent my whole life getting away from that family and that name and what came with it, and I didn't want you or Marcus to ever have to carry any of that." I said, "Dad, you transferred our house." He closed his eyes. It was the only way to settle it without going back to court. Gerald threatened to pursue it further, to make everything public, to drag the name back up. Your mother and I agreed it was better to just... He stopped. "We didn't think it would affect you. You haven't lived there in years." "I lived there for 2 years while I was getting back on my feet," I said. "And you told the mediator I had no residential interest." He didn't answer. "That's fraud, Dad," I said. It was the first time I'd said the word out loud. It sounded very quiet and very final. Not maybe fraud. Not gray area. My attorney used the word fraud. He put his hands flat on the table, the way he used to do at Sunday dinners when he was about to say something he'd thought through carefully. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let the court decide," I said. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I have a right to know what happened to the house I helped pay for. And because I needed you to know that I know." Marcus took it harder than I expected. Not the news about our father, but the news about Diane. He had spent his whole life hating her the way you hate someone when you've absorbed that hatred from people you love without ever questioning the source. Finding out she was our great-aunt, that she had moved to that street to maintain some connection to a family my father had cut off, that she had watched us grow up from 4 houses away because there was no other way she was allowed to be present. That broke something in Marcus that I think needed breaking. He called me crying at 11 at night twice in the first week. I let him. I had done the same kind of crying, just privately in the car. My mother was the one who surprised me most. I had expected anger. I had expected her to close ranks around my father the way she always had. Instead, she called me 3 days after my conversation with him and she said, "I want you to know I'm sorry." I didn't say anything because I didn't know what kind of sorry she meant. She said, "Not for everything. Some of it I'd do again, because some of it was about protecting this family, but for not telling you who you were, who we were. I'm sorry for that. It wasn't a full accounting. It wasn't everything I might have wanted. But it was real, the way she said it was real. Not performed, not strategic. Just tired and honest and too late. I said, I met Diane. She made a sound I couldn't quite categorize. I know, she said. She called me. Of all the things that surprised me, that might have been the most surprising. You two talk? Not often, my mother said, but sometimes. We're two old women who both love the same stubborn man in different ways. You find a strange peace with people when that's the truth. The court proceedings took 4 months. I won't walk through all of it because the legal mechanics are less interesting than what came out of them. What mattered was this. The court found that my father had misrepresented the residential interest status of the property in the 2019 settlement documentation, and that the transfer to the Whitmore Family Revocable Trust was therefore void as it pertained to my protected interest. The family home could not be transferred without proper notification and compensation to me. Gerald Jr., who had, I learned, genuinely believed the transfer was clean and was angry at my father for the misrepresentation, not at me, agreed to a renegotiated arrangement. The house would remain in my parents' names until their deaths, at which point Marcus and I would inherit it through normal succession. Gerald Jr. received a cash settlement from the estate funds for his portion. Everyone walked away with something. It wasn't clean. None of it was clean, but it was resolved. My father came to the courthouse on the day the judge signed the order. He didn't have to be there. His attorney handled it, but he came. He sat 2 rows behind me. When it was over and I turned around, he was still sitting there with his hands in his lap, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him look. He said, I'm glad you found it. I said, the wrong blue folder? He almost smiled. I should have told you a long time ago. I said, yeah, you should have. We walked out of the courthouse together. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness takes longer than 4 months, and I'm not sure it's something you arrive at in a single moment anyway. But it was something. A door cracked open. A beginning of something that might become understanding, given enough time. The last thing I want to tell you is about Diane. After the court proceedings, after everything had settled into its new shape, I went back to the pale yellow colonial with the wind chime. I brought flowers. I wasn't sure what else to bring, and flowers seemed both insufficient and honest. She opened the door before I knocked, which I had started to suspect was just a thing she did. We sat on her porch. The wind chime moved in a small March wind. From where we were sitting, I could see my parents' house 4 doors down, unchanged on the outside from the house it had always been. The house where I had grown up, not knowing my own name, was missing a history. Diane told me about Eleanor, about my grandfather before he became someone my father needed to escape. She told me about the farm in its good years, how it had looked in summer, how she and Eleanor had picked blackberries along the fence line when they were girls. She told me what she knew about my father as a young man, the version of him that existed before he became the version I knew. It was strange to grieve someone who was still alive, but I was grieving something, a version of the past that might have been, if things had been different. A version of my childhood where I might have known this woman, might have gone with my father to that farm in Delaware County, might have had a relationship with a part of my family that instead spent 3 decades 4 houses away, visible and forbidden. At some point, Diane said, you know, I never blamed you, any of you. You were only what you were taught to be. I thought about that. Then I said, what do I do with all of it now? She thought about it for a while. The wind chime moved. You do what all of us do, she said finally. You keep going. You take what's true and you carry it with you, and you try not to pass the silence on. I drove home as the sun was going down. I went past my parents' house, still 4 doors down from the pale yellow colonial, still with the ordinary look of a house that contained an ordinary life. I thought about my father inside, and my mother, and Marcus, who was coming to Sunday dinner for the first time in months. I thought about the document in the wrong blue folder, and the name on a 1987 land record, and a wind chime I'd been able to hear from my bedroom window every quiet night of my childhood, coming from a house I was never allowed to look at. I thought, I looked. Finally, I looked. And now I know.